The invisible map of power. If you open a world map and look at national borders, the planet seems simple. Countries, capitals, oceans separating continents. But that map doesn't tell the full story, because hidden within that map is another network, a quieter one. A network of military bases, air bases, naval ports, strategic installations scattered across the globe. And if you start connecting those points on the map, a strange pattern begins to appear. Some countries seem to have a presence everywhere. But why? Why would a country build military bases thousands of kilometers away from its own borders? Why station soldiers in places that aren't technically their own territory? And perhaps the most interesting question of all, do military bases simply defend nations? Or do they quietly shape the balance of power across the entire world? The basic idea. Let's start with something simple. What exactly is a military base? At its core, a military base is just a place where armed forces operate from. Aircraft take off from there. Ships dock there. Supplies are stored there. Soldiers train, sleep, plan, and prepare. But location changes everything. A base inside your own country is one thing. A base on the other side of the world is something very different. Because when a country builds or controls a base far from home, it suddenly gains something incredibly valuable: reach. Distance is power. Think about geography for a moment. If a crisis happens on the other side of the planet, distance becomes a problem. Troops take time to travel. Aircraft require refueling. Ships move slowly across oceans. But if a country already has bases nearby, that distance disappears. Planes can launch immediately. Ships are already in position. Troops can respond within hours instead of weeks. This ability, the ability to project power quickly, is one of the main reasons military bases exist. But the story doesn't stop there, because if speed were the only reason, countries might only build bases near their own borders. Yet when we look at the global map, we see something much bigger: a network around the planet. Today, some nations maintain hundreds of military installations outside their own territory, airfields in foreign countries, naval ports in distant oceans, radar stations on remote islands. These bases form something like a global infrastructure, almost like the invisible highways of military power. And once you notice this network, it becomes difficult to ignore. Why are there American bases in Germany? Why are there naval facilities in Japan? Why are there installations on small islands that most people have never heard of? And perhaps most importantly, why do some countries welcome these bases, while others strongly oppose them? To answer that question, we need to go back in time, because this global network didn't appear overnight. It grew out of one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. After the Second World War. When World War II ended in 1945, the world was exhausted. Cities across Europe and Asia had been devastated. Millions of people had died. Entire economies were struggling to rebuild. But while the war had ended, peace did not immediately feel secure. Two new superpowers were emerging: the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had enormous military strength. Both had very different political systems. And both were beginning to view the world through a lens of competition. This rivalry would eventually become known as the Cold War, the logic of presence. During the early Cold War years, the United States began building military bases across Europe and Asia. At first glance, this might seem strange. The war had ended, so why keep troops overseas? The reasoning was strategic. American leaders believed that if military forces were already stationed in key regions, they could respond quickly to any potential conflict. Bases in Western Europe helped protect NATO allies. Bases in Japan and South Korea helped maintain stability in East Asia. Naval facilities across the Pacific allowed ships to operate far from American shores. Each base served as a small piece of a much larger system, a system designed to ensure that no single region could easily fall under the control of a rival power. But bases are not just military. Here is where things become more complicated. Military bases are not only about defense, they also send signals, political signals. When a powerful country builds a base in another region, it is effectively saying, "We are here, we are watching, we are involved." For allies, this can be reassuring. For rivals, it can feel threatening. And for local populations, reactions can vary widely. Some communities benefit economically from the presence of bases. Jobs appear. Infrastructure improves. Local businesses grow. But in other places, the presence of foreign troops can create tension. Questions about sovereignty, independence, and influence begin to emerge. A question worth asking. So at this point, another question naturally appears. If military bases are so powerful, why don't all countries build them? Why don't we see hundreds of overseas bases belonging to every nation? The answer lies in resources. Building and maintaining bases abroad is extremely expensive. It requires transportation networks, supply chains, diplomatic agreements, and enormous financial investment. Only a few countries possess the economic and logistical capacity to maintain such global systems, which is why the distribution of bases around the world often reflects the distribution of global power itself. But this still leaves one fascinating mystery. How did this network grow so large, and how did it survive long after the Cold War ended? Because if the Cold War was the reason these bases existed, why do so many of them still remain today? A map that never disappeared. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many analysts believed the world would become less militarized. Some predicted that alliances would weaken. Others thought overseas bases might gradually close. But something unexpected happened. Many bases stayed open. Some new ones were even built. And the network continued expanding, which raises an uncomfortable question. Are military bases only defensive tools? Or are they something more enduring? Something that continues shaping global influence long after the original conflict that created them has disappeared? That question leads us to the next chapter of the story. Because to truly understand military bases, we need to examine how they were used during the Cold War, and how they became one of the most important instruments of global power. Why military bases control the world? The Cold War base network. By the early 1950s, the world was no longer recovering from World War II. It was preparing for something else, a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. Unlike previous wars, this one would not be fought primarily with tanks crossing borders or massive armies clashing directly. Instead, it would be a global competition for influence, and military bases became one of the most important tools in that competition. 2 blocks, 1 planet. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union increased, the world slowly divided into two large blocs. On one side stood NATO and its Western allies. On the other side stood the Soviet Union and its network of communist states. Each side believed the other posed an existential threat. And because both possessed nuclear weapons, direct war between them could be catastrophic. So instead of fighting directly, both sides focused on positioning. Where should troops be stationed? Where should aircraft be deployed? Where should missiles be placed? The answers to those questions shaped the geography of military bases for decades. NATO's expanding presence. When NATO was created in 1949, its original purpose was simple: collective defense. If one member was attacked, then others would respond. But collective defense required something more than signatures on a treaty. It required physical presence. American forces began establishing bases across Western Europe. Germany became one of the largest hubs. Air bases appeared in the United Kingdom. Naval facilities expanded in Italy and Spain. Radar stations were placed in northern regions to detect potential attacks. From the perspective of NATO leaders, these bases served as deterrents. They signaled that Western Europe would not stand alone. But from the perspective of the Soviet Union, the same bases looked very different. They looked like encirclement. The Soviet response. The Soviet Union did not ignore these developments. In 1955, it formed its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This alliance connected the Soviet Union with several Eastern European states, including Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Just like NATO, the Warsaw Pact relied on military coordination and strategic positioning. Soviet troops were stationed across Eastern Europe. Air bases were developed in satellite states. Missile systems were deployed across the region. In effect, Europe became a continent filled with military infrastructure on both sides. Two rival networks, facing each other across a divided map, closing. So when we look at a map of military bases today, we're not just looking at buildings or runways. We're looking at a system that took decades to build. A network shaped by wars, alliances, and global competition. Some people see these bases as protection. Others see them as influence. But one thing is difficult to deny. Military bases are more than strategic locations. They are symbols of presence. And in international politics, presence often means power, which raises an interesting question for the future. In a world where new powers are rising and global tensions are shifting, will the map of military bases stay the same? Or are we watching the beginning of an entirely new network of power?